All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the second lecture of Korean history, and we're going to look at the end of the Three Kingdoms period and the establishment of unified Shilla, and then into the Goryeo period. So in this week, what I'd like you to keep in mind again is that we are focusing on political history. So that means we're looking at how the state or the government is structured, how it comes to be organized, and how these different states then interact with each other. So if you'll remember from last lecture that the some very typical characteristics of this ancient period is that there is a lot of war. So because these states are not fully formed and they're not solidified in such a way that we have a well-defined Korea or well-defined China that exists, that the borders are fluctuating and the populations are moving, and identity is attached to one's locale rather than the larger state apparatus. And so because of this, we have a lot of conflict. And if we look at the region as a whole, so we had Goguryeo, which occupied this northern territory. These borders were constantly moving and expanding or contracting. And once these borders move and they contract, or you have peoples that are, let's say, in these northern areas and they start moving into these areas or these areas, and they come into contact with other tribes or other peoples, then we have conflict emerging. And the discussion questions that I had asked you last week were to get you to start thinking about, well, why would these people move, or why would these territories expand or contract, or why would there be conflict along these areas or along these areas in the first place? And usually this is over resources, because we are in the ancient period and because these are agricultural economies, and it's a subsistence economy, so everybody just produces what they themselves can consume. But if you have a bad crop or a bad harvest and you haven't produced enough food, then you need to start searching elsewhere. And if you don't have a good relationship with these people, or these people have also had a difficult year in terms of their harvest, then there's going to be conflict. So we have to think about these things on those terms. And so this is about trying to reorient your thinking again. So getting you to shift your thinking from modern viewpoint to what could possibly have existed in this ancient period. And so then this leads us to the question of, when you expand your territory, then how do you maintain control? So Goguryeo didn't start off with this very large territory, but eventually expanded into this very large kingdom. And what happens when you have now established control? How do you maintain that? Because a lot of these peoples in, let's say in these areas up here, they are, again, they have their identities attached to the locale, and that's where their loyalties lie. So how do you incorporate these people into the larger state apparatus, and how do you mobilize them? How do you extract taxes from them? And this is where the nuts and bolts of how a government is organized and how it is run, this is when this all comes into play. So we will be talking about this, and then we're going to look simultaneously at how these different states interacted with each other, because again, since this is a time of conflict and there are many battles and many wars, what do you think would be the main objective in establishing foreign relations amongst these different states? Now, the common sense would say that you would want to establish some kind of system where people can live peacefully and without war or without constant conflict, or at least reduce the amount of conflict. So we see then also that foreign relations begin to evolve and develop in that direction, so that there is an attempt to try to minimize the amount of conflict, or at least decrease it, and to try to establish a certain amount of stability. Because that's really what you want when you establish a government or a kingdom or a dynasty, is you want stability. Usually the leaders of these kinds of political entities don't have a vision of, oh, maybe we'll just be here for 5 years or 8 years. No, their vision is to establish a dynasty and to be there for as long as possible. So again, the question is, how do you do that? So these are some of the questions that we'll be looking at in today's lecture. So as we discussed before, we have Goguryeo, Shilla, Baekje down here in the southwestern region of the peninsula, and the Tang Dynasty, which has overtaken the Sui Dynasty on the Chinese mainland. And as a result, we have a series of conflicts and also alliances that begin to form. So Goguryeo had come into conflict with both the Sui and the Tang. There are no natural barriers along this border here, so it's because that border is not, we don't have like a well-defined wall or river or something that delineates where that border is. It's easy to cross over inadvertently and to come into conflict. So we have conflict with Goguryeo and the Sui and the Tang dynasties. Japan down here had established ties with Baekje, so they have a lot of interaction between these two. Goguryeo and Baekje, they eventually form an alliance against Shilla. And so Shilla had gone to Japan to try to break up this alliance between Baekje and Japan said no. And then Shilla had gone to Goguryeo and asked Goguryeo if they could break up their alliance and, kind of stop picking on them. But Goguryeo said no. And so Shilla eventually goes to the Tang Dynasty and says, hey, can we establish an alliance? And this was really extremely advantageous for Shilla. So let's look at the Tang Dynasty for just a moment here. So these are the dates of the Tang Dynasty here, and its capital was at Chang'an, which is modern-day Xi'an. And when we look at Chang'an, so by the time we get to this period, the Tang Dynasty, by the 10th century, actually, so by the end of the Tang Dynasty, the Tang Dynasty controlled 1/3 of the world's population. 1 out of 3 people in the entire world fell under the jurisdiction of the Tang Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty is, without a doubt, the most powerful entity, not only in the region, but arguably in this half of the world. And so we have this very, very strong dynasty that is occupying this area right here. Chang'an, or the capital of the Tang Dynasty, this was kind of the endpoint for the Silk Road. So we have the Silk Road, which went along this way and then also went into Korea, and the focal point was in Chang'an. And if we look at the capital, Chang'an itself, so it was a walled city, and it was a planned city. So all of its streets ran north, south, and east and west. And within the city, there were 1 million people living within the walls, and another million people living just outside of the walls of Chang'an. Now, if we think of it in terms of today, even today, a city with 2 million people, a population of 2 million people, is considered to be a fairly large city. So if we think about 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, and we have a city of 2 million people, this is very, very impressive. So we have this city, the imperial city here, and because it was the endpoint of the Silk Road, we ended up having a very diverse population within the Tang Dynasty. So peoples from all over the world had come to Chang'an. And so we have not only people throughout the Tang Dynasty that were living in Chang'an, but you also have peoples from Central Asia, from Persia, from all parts of the world that are living here. And so as you can see here, within the city, there were Buddhist monasteries, there were Venetian, Nestorian churches, so there were Christian churches here, there were Taoist monasteries. I mean, it was very, very diverse. And this is one of the really defining characteristics of Chang'an, was its diversity and the fact that you have within this one city just such a eclectic mix of people. So this picture here on the left is a painting that depicts all the different peoples and their different ethnicities and races and religions and languages, and they're all congregating within Chang'an. This picture here on the right, this depicts, can you tell what these two people are doing here? They are on horses, and if you look at what they're holding in their hands, these are mallets, and they are trying to hit this ball down here. So if you guess that they're playing polo, you would be correct. Polo is usually associated with which country? Usually with the United Kingdom. But in fact, polo did not originate in the United Kingdom, but it originated in Persia. And so it was introduced from Persia into China during the Tang Dynasty, and it became a favorite pastime of Tang Dynasty elites. So this is just one example to show you of how diverse and cosmopolitan and sophisticated the peoples of the Tang Dynasty were. All right, so this is the behemoth that Shilla makes its alliance with. And so in 655, Goguryeo and Baekje, they invaded Shilla. And so the Tang Dynasty sends 3 expeditions against Goguryeo, which all fail. And so the Tang and the Shilla join forces and they invade Baekje. So in 660, Baekje falls. And after this, they start to shore up their forces, and in 667, there is a joint Shilla-Tang attack against the Goguryeo, and they're able to capture Pyongyang, the capital, the following year in 668, and shortly after Goguryeo falls. And so this then leads into what we call the unified Shilla period, because now we have not these 3 separate kingdoms, but now just one kingdom, which is Shilla. But there is a lot of struggle between Shilla and the Tang Dynasty immediately afterwards, because although the original agreement was that Shilla was going to be able to govern everything south of this river right here, the Chang said, actually, no, we're just going to make you governor of this region. And the Shilla government was not happy about this. And so they start to come into conflict with, with the Tang Dynasty. Now, they were able to enlist help within this region, and so eventually we have a tenuous border that is set up here. We have Shilla with its capital down in Gyeongju, and many former Goguryeo peoples then they move further north into this area, and they join forces with the tribes that are up here, and they form a separate state, which is called Pare. All right, so let's take a look at the government of Shilla. So the way that the government was structured was you have the king and you have his officials. There was something called the Hwabek that was established, and the Hwabek was a council of nobles. And what they did was they made policy and they implemented policies, government policies. They also had the power to select the king. So, but the king was the head of the Hwabek. So what we see over the period of this unified Shilla dynasty, increasing power of the king and the decline in aristocratic power. Let me move this a little bit so that you can see that. And so we see that the Hwabek begin to lose authority to the king, since he is the head of the Hwabek council. And we also have a problem with succession. So when the king dies, and if there is no heir to take his place, then who becomes the next king? Is it, it could be a younger brother, it could be a cousin, it could be a sister. There are all these different options, but if it's not clearly outlined or designated who the next heir is going to be, then you have all of these different individuals then who are vying for power and who are saying, well, I want to be the next king. And so we have this problem occurring during the Shilla dynasty. What we also see happening is increasing bureaucratization within the government. So in 571, a board of Ministry of War was established, and then in the following century, a chancellor office, the board of justice, the board of ministry of surveillance, these were all established. Now, why would you want to expand the bureaucracy, or why would you want to increase bureaucratization within the government? This allows for these different specialized organizations to have specific responsibilities that they take care of. So it's more efficient. We don't have an overlap of responsibilities. We don't have different groups that are contradicting each other, or we don't have redundancy. And so this is generally considered to be a characteristic of a more efficient and better operating government when we see this kind of increasing bureaucratization. So this Ministry of Surveillance here, their function was to investigate and make sure that the officials were behaving in a correct way, so that there was no corruption, and they were kind of like an interior surveillance mechanism where they became the eyes and the ears of the king. So this was really one way for the king to control the officials, the bureaucrats, and this is part of the reason why we have increasing power of the king during the dynasty. Now, we had seen, because of these three different kingdoms that existed, Shilla, Baekje, and Goguryeo, and these different powerful aristocrats that were in these different areas, they all had their own personal armies. So when the unified Shilla dynasty was established, they got rid of these personal armies and they established a kingdom-wide army. Why would they do that? Well, if you have, let's say, a powerful aristocrat way up in the north who is a former Goguryeo person, and his attachment is still to that particular locale and to maybe to Goguryeo, if he has a very strong army, he could possibly overthrow the government. And so to decrease the possibility of that happening, they disbanded these personal armies and they established a kingdom-wide army in Shilla. And we also see the development of local administration. So we have the capital in Gyeongju, and then the next large organization were the districts. And then within the districts, you have prefectures. Within the prefectures, there are counties. And within the counties, there are villages or special settlements. So we have this local administration and this attempt to organize all of the different areas within the country. Now, what we see also is that during this time, because of the, again, you know, this is a, that there's a lot of potential for conflict among these different entities, and during this time there were quite a bit of pirates that would roam the sea and kind of wreak havoc along the coastline of the Korean Peninsula. And so this really caused chaos within the region, because what we saw happening was that when these pirates would invade, not only would they steal food and necessities, but they would also kidnap people. And then they would enslave them and they would sell them as slaves. And so there was this huge slave trafficking problem that develops within this region. And this person named Chang Bogo, who lived from 787 to 846, when he was traveling back and forth from the Tang Dynasty, in the Tang Dynasty, he saw that there were all of these Shillan people who had been enslaved and that were being sold on the slave markets. And this made him very sad, and so he decided to try to do something about this. And so what he ended up doing was, out of trade, he was able to amass quite a bit of wealth for himself, and he was able to establish in this island of Wando, which is in the southwestern area down here. He was able to establish kind of like a headquarters on Wando and set up a naval defense establishment there. He had a semi-private navy of about 10,000 men. And by setting up shop here, he then started controlling the international trade over the waters and was also able to get control of the piracy problem. So he was this influential figure, and he became so powerful that the king at some point said that he would then marry his daughter to Changbogol, but this was a very controversial decision on the part of the king, and the king eventually reneged on it, and there was a revolt, and Changpokgo was killed. But I would like to pause at this point and show you a short video of Changpokgo. So I'm going to stop here and then check for the link on YouTube for the Changpokgo video, and then you can continue on with part 2 of the lecture.